Welcome to Tailboard Talk, a fourth shift fitcast. The mission of Tailboard Talk and the fourth shift fitness is to educate and train fire service personnel to increase durability and decrease the potential for injuries and their associated costs. My name is Chris Morella, owner and founder of Fourth Shift Fitness. I'll use my experience as a personal trainer, strength coach, and 15-year veteran of the fire service to deliver tips, tricks, lessons, and information specifically geared towards the health and wellness of firefighters and paramedics. Each episode, you'll leave with immediate deliverables that will improve performance and resilience and keep you in the fight through your career and into retirement. Let's get into it.
Ready?
What's up, guys? Welcome to Tailboard Talk. Chris and Curt here. Chris from Fourth Shift Fitness and Curt from LGN Performance. And today we're going to dive a little bit more into training. We're out here in the garage gym because stuff's going on inside. Happen to be under a flight path, and we have noisy neighbors, so get ready for that. Could be fun. We're going to talk about three common gaps in common training programs. So if you buy a mass marketed training program, or if you follow kind of a mainstream one, or even if you make up your own, there's three areas where people typically miss the mark, and we're going to talk about those. Obviously, just like the top 10 bodyweight movements, when we're going to go into some explanations. But we should leave you with some pretty good takeaways, and not only what most people miss, but how to implement it into your program. So the first one we're going to talk about is rotation and anti-rotation, and it falls into training the almighty core. It's a piece of the puzzle that will actually keep you from getting injured more necessarily than just doing sit-ups or planks, because we operate through motion. And we get hurt through not being able to control motion. So, Curt, why don't you take us through your understanding of the difference between training your core and then effectively training rotation and anti-rotation?
So I think I just go back a little bit and we kind of look at what the musculoskeletal system's role is for us. And it's really got three purposes. The first is to produce force, which I think everyone has kind of a knock on. That's just lifting weights, bench press, things along those lines. The second is joint stabilization, so that as you're walking, you can walk, you can ambulate and not have your knees cave in or tear ACLs or things along those lines. And then the third is receiving stress on your body. And kind of like you just said, a lot of injuries happen in that third range of receiving a stress, or a stress is too great for your tissues to handle. And oftentimes we don't train being able to receive stress on the body. We train produce force, but we don't train to receive it. And so looking at different movements and different training modalities that can work that reception of force on your body versus just producing force is a big gap in training programs.
So you put the three phases up there, but they actually go right in kind of the opposite order. Those are the three responsibilities, but the order they go in is typically they dampen force first or control it, then they align the joints and stabilize them, and then they allow you to produce force. Mm-hmm. And I think the most common but kind of under-recognized instance in when this happens in injuries is the hamstring tear from the 45-year-old softball player running to first base, right?
Or the 29-year-old, I think, when I did it. Maybe?
Well, I mean, that was more of a hamstring explosion.
Yeah.
But, and it looks like, this guy's running, he's producing force. That's when he tears his muscles. But if you look at when it usually tears, it's when your heel strikes the ground and dampens force. You're actually absorbing force and kind of putting on the brakes for a split second. And when your muscles try to slow down that force to then align your joints and then produce more, that's when it erupts. And so
I think you see that a lot more in social media with calves and Achilles. You watch someone slow-mo plant on the ground, a basketball player or something, come down from a jump, and you'll see like the rubber band snap and shoot up from their ankle up to the back of their knee.
But then most people see like, when he jumped, he couldn't jump, and they assume that's
right.
when it happened, right?
Right.
We just saw a video of that similar mechanism recently with that crazy sissy squat variation where the guy was going back into that reclined position, and he had the hinge point of his knees, and the sissy squat machine or whatever was behind his calves, and instead of going into a typical squat pattern, he kind of did a reverse plank kind of thing, and the leverage acting on his knee joint was just too much, and everything took a vacation in that moment. The video said ACL tear, and then I saw several other videos that had different diagnoses on it. But
at any rate, it was catastrophic failure.
It was a bummer. Yeah. It's going to be 6 to 8 months, whatever it is. But that was dampening force. So it was an eccentric part of the movement where he was trying to slow down his body. He was trying to control and dampen force, and that's when it let go. If it happened when he was contracting or coming back up, it would have been a different story. But even with that, even if it happens when you're contracting or coming back up, the chance, most likely, the damage happened on the way down, and you just finished it off on the way up. So let's get back to rotation, anti-rotation now, specifically with core. What's some of your go-to rotation or anti-rotation movements for core training?
So rotation, I use a lot of medicine ball throws in different variations and positions that you can set up with to throw medicine balls. That typically ends up being, and whether that's off the wall or whether that's, just down turf or down, your lawn or whatever it ends up being. But those typically end up being where we get a lot of our rotational training methods from. We'll use landmines a lot too. The landmine attachment is I like a lot for rotation. Anti-rotation, actually kind of the same thing. We'll use landmines for anti-rotation too. But that gets into a little bit more of the traditional, planks and pillars, lateral pillars for anti-rotation is usually the go-to for those.
So there's got to be a difference between rotation usually is what we talked about, producing force typically, right? Mm-hmm. And anti-rotation being dampening force. So that's when Curt's talking about medicine balls, it's usually, unless you're throwing it against the wall and then catching it again, it's going to be a force production kind of deal where you set up in a good position, then explode out of it and whip this thing from a hip or from a shoulder or a shot put kind of position or sandbag toss or something like that. Mm-hmm. Anti-rotation is especially important, though, for us in the fire service because we have to produce force. Like when you're cutting a hole with a hand tool or throwing a ladder and you're kind of in that stagger single arm push position, that's all important for producing force. But I think what we see more often probably for first responders is dampening force. I know the times that I've had a shoulder or back injury, just a strain or whatever, is when I was lifting someone or moving something, and then there was a sudden change in kind of the environment. Either the patient shifted or moved, or something happened. Somebody else kind of failed on the lift, and you all of a sudden had a way more of leverage against you. And then my inability to kind of control that and dampen it obviously wasn't good enough because then something in the chain kind of let go when that extra force got applied, right? Right.
Or even if it's, you have a patient on a backboard and you're four cornering it and three of you are the same height and one person's 6 inches shorter, there's going to be a little, adjustment to leveling at the top that everyone's going to have a little extra force put on them that they weren't expecting. Or, you're walking with a cot and you step down off a stair or off of a curb that you didn't see, that being able to stabilize the load that you're carrying, and not injure yourself is kind of the force that we're looking at.
And that's different than, that's something you just can't train with doing sit-ups, and really standard planks. You need a little bit of asymmetrical movement in your plank, either a single arm skydiver or marching feet or something like that.
And the goal really is sometimes it's not to train exactly what you think you're going to expect out there. It's to give yourself a suit of armor strong enough to withhold the unknown one time, Right. So I wouldn't go out and practice fake stepping off stairs, to surprise myself or something like that in my training. I would just want my training to have prepared me enough for that one time that I do step off awkwardly that I'm able to not get hurt doing that.
Yeah, or just minimize the amount of damage, right? Mm-hmm. I'm okay being sore the next day from a unexpected or surprise or out of the ordinary event like that. That's expected, right? Mm-hmm. But to have to go off on injury or go get actual medical attention is a different game altogether. I think this goes into a philosophy talk too, though, but with the training, it's important to go back to what we talked about a few episodes ago of when you're doing rotation or anti-rotation training, you only do it until the quality of it starts to get a little bit less or sacrificed, right? So if you're doing like a push-up position, single arm skydiver, so you're starting a push-up position, your feet go abnormally wide for stability, and then you pick up one hand and you kind of wave it from your hip to overhead, and kind of like a wave for help scenario. The goal there is to keep your chest flat to the ground or parallel to the ground, and keep your hips parallel to the ground also, so they're not peeking up on whatever side or rocking back and forth. If you do 4 or 5 of those and all of a sudden your hips are sagging, or you're really picking up one hip to compensate, that's kind of when you cut that movement off, because then you're not training what you're intending to. You may be training something else that's valuable, but if you have an intentional purpose for your training, then you're missing it at that point. So you need to go back and just take a breath and reset, because like Curt said, more or less we're preparing for those low frequency, high risk events with movement, with pertains to movement. So you don't need to do a million of these core exercises. You need to be able to get proficient at them, so when it counts 1 or 2 times a month, or even every couple months, you can kind of pull them out of your trick bag and you're prepared for it. So going into that, those are kind of my favorite rotation, anti-rotation ones. I really like the landmine for producing force. Single arm stuff, stagger stuff. When it comes to core stability in general, specifically anti-rotation stability, there's far better movements, I think, than like a single dumbbell front rack squat. And double dumbbell front rack squat is also awesome, but that has less to do with rotation, anti-rotation, more to do with just core stability. There's something about the front squat pattern, though, that really just makes your abs really sore when you don't think it should. And so if you put a heavy weight on one shoulder, or even somehow push it overhead and go into a single arm overhead squat, your hips and your legs are going to get tied up, and you'll feel your lower back getting tied up because it's difficult. But when you stand up and rest, you're really going to feel more or less like a core burn, almost like you did a bunch of sit-ups. So that's got to be one of my top ones. Then for anti-rotation, like I said, I'm big on the single arm plank variations, marching planks, like the plank quick hand stuff, anything where you're moving your arms or legs around and then trying to keep your core stable and still. I think the old fallback is always going to be like the Pallof press or something like that.
Yeah.
Phenomenal movements. The point, though, is to put leverage, take your appendages and your extremities, put leverage against your core, and try not to let your core move. Try not to let your shoulders disassociate from your hips, and that can be rotation or that can be anti-rotation training. With rotation training, you're kind of trying to do the opposite, produce force, and then let your shoulders move after you've produced force and kind of fly away.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite ones now too is I like loading up like a laterally resisted lunge too.
Yeah.
So kind of the same idea of a Pallof press where you have, a load 90 degrees, off to your side, and then you work through a lunge pattern and you try and make the lunge look perfect as if no force was acting against you. And so that you're controlling your rotation, anti-rotation at that point. Those are kind of my go-tos too. I like those a lot.
Yeah. That what we're talking about, unfortunately, simplifies strength and conditioning into just a few principles of you're going to take this external weight and do something with it and try not to let it affect you or crush you, and the more we do that as first responders and as firefighters and paramedics, the better we're going to be, because all we have is external forces kind of crashing down on us. Right. So getting better at that will be getting better in general. All right. Number 2, and this is one that I know you've had several conversations with because of the CrossFit background, and now when you encounter people that do primarily CrossFit, and of course, like we talked about before, there are very good CrossFit gyms out there, but there are some more or less stereotypical CrossFit gyms. The number 2 thing that most people are missing in their program is a presence and an equal ratio of pulling compared to pushing or anything else really that they do. Mm-hmm. What have you seen when you've had conversations with people, mostly about the kind of the cognitive dissonance between what they think they're doing and what they're actually doing in their programs when it comes to being equal or well-rounded?
I think most people just don't have a grasp on they're actually needing to be rowing or pulling put into a workout, and I think that sometimes we assume that people have a bit of a higher exercise vocabulary of what should be incorporated in a program, or maybe an eye for a well-rounded program, and it's just not the case. So a lot of time it's just lack of education in the beginning of understanding what's important to have in a complete program. But most of the time, it's like people like, we have our show muscles, which are the ones that we look in the mirror and see, so we have the things that support that, whether it's curls and squats and bench press and sit-ups. And then we have the go muscles, which really are the ones that do all the work, which are glutes and hamstrings and, muscles along your back and along the posterior chain. And typically there's an absence of those. And a lot of times, I think if you're building a program for yourself, it's because they're just not fun, and they're not fun. And sometimes they're not easy to rig up, and if you're working out in your house and you don't have access to dumbbells, it can be difficult to come up with a way to figure out how to row, and then even if you do have a band, it's like, well, what do I come up with for my anchor point?
Right.
And, so I think that, one, people don't have fun doing them because they don't like training them, and they would prefer to bench or do, there are other things that they like doing. And I don't know what the exact ratio is. I've always, I think the common rule of thumb is that you should be looking for like a 3-to-1 pull to push ratio. I don't know if that's a scientific thing or if that's just a thing that you shoot for that and realize that they'll be about even, somewhere along the way of the program. But going back to the kind of the go muscle things, just the absence of having any pulling in your program or a lack of pulling is going to be a significant performance downgrade for you in your program itself. Just the benefits that being able to develop the musculature and those pulling patterns for increased performance and reduction of injury is essential to have in a program.
Yeah, they're really difficult. This is one of the things I struggle with my remote personal training clients, is if most of them have to make a little bit of investment on the front side to get a band or a suspension trainer or something that they can pull with, because unless you're going to hang underneath your kitchen table and kind of be creative and also take your life in your hands,
right.
It's difficult. It's difficult to pull or to get a lot of activation. There's always the hinge pattern. There's always the single leg RDL stuff, and there's always the skydiver actions. There's always kind of Dan John's bat wing thing. But as for actually loading up a pull, it can be pretty tough. You can lift all the milk jugs you want, but at a certain point, 10 pounds of fluid isn't going to be enough for you.
Right. And that's the thing is I think people discount how much you can really load up a pull pattern, And I don't know if it's just because I suck at bench press, but my pulling pattern's always been kind of the alpha for me in that upper body stuff. I've been able to pull away more, and maybe it's just because I like it better. But I'm the opposite. I suck at bench press, so I avoid it at all costs, and I try and row as much as possible.
I feel the same way. There are few movements that feel better when you actually load them up heavy. Probably like 20 more pounds than you expect you can do than like a single arm dumbbell row. Mm-hmm. Or if you're feeling froggy and you feel like you got a good position, going into like a barbell bent over row can feel like you just want to rip the world in half at that point because you feel really strong.
Right.
But you got to be willing to load up, and that comes with a lot of training to be able to get into a good hinge position or a stagger position, or know how to support your spine during that, because we see a lot of people that when they row, they use momentum. And that's just an old bodybuilding kind of hack that you see, right? You get some body English into it that also prevents a lot of people from going heavy, I think. Mm-hmm. But I would say rowing is one of the first things I look to implement in somebody's program, and it's rarely seen. I think what we've seen is a lot of people will confuse some high rep, high speed Olympic lifts and Olympic movements as sufficient rowing. So they'll take like a high rep hang power clean with a moderate or low weight, or even a snatch or even an overhead press, and they'll consider that a back exercise more than anything. And when we start talking to them, we kind of show them that there's a pulling portion of all those movements potentially, but overall it's a press movement that's not really getting you developed where you need to be.
Right.
But that's also a byproduct of what that the sport of fitness is. It's a lot of push. It's a lot of go.
It's that, and it's working with your environment there. And it's been a long time since I've looked through CrossFit workouts, but typically, you might be able to add some more in here, but it's pull-ups or band-assisted pull-ups. It's that sumo deadlift high pull thing, and then maybe you get some single dumbbell hang power snatches or Olympic lifting in there. And so even if you look at those, those are all I would consider to be in a vertical plane. So you're getting no horizontal pulling in there at all. And some of those facilities just aren't meant to be set up for having, a full rack of dumbbells or, 10 benches in there that you can use for support for rows. It just doesn't necessarily work into the workout program itself of, whether you're doing things for reps or doing things for time. It just doesn't fit in the cookie cutter, Yeah. And whether that's a known thing that the coaches are avoiding because they're trying to program to their environment, or whether they just don't value those in general, it just typically ends up being something that gets missed in what I consider to be a typical CrossFit program.
So I think the easiest way that people can look at their program and tell if they're doing pulling movements is if thankfully, it's all very obvious by the name of it, right? So if you don't see anything in your program that says pull or row, it's pretty much it.
Not a rowing machine either.
Not a rowing machine, yeah. They're pretty easily identifiable. So if you look through and see, now the other movements are more difficult to see because they go by weightlifting names or Olympic lifting names. You'll see push or press or jerk or snatch. Those are all push movements necessarily. But rows are far more obvious to see because they will say row.
Right.
Single arm dumbbell row, double dumbbell row, hand supported row, TRX row, H pull, stuff like that. If you don't see row or pull in your movement vocabulary on the board there, that's an easy way to tell if you're missing them.
Do you have a favorite row variation?
I like heavy bent over rows. Whether it's a single arm supported dumbbell row or barbell bent over row, if I can grab it and try to test my grip and also my posterior chain a little bit and then feel like my back is getting into it for 6 to 8 heavy reps and then mix it in with some other stuff in the complex, that's a good row for me.
I agree.
I like that one.
I agree. I would say TRX rows are almost always a staple of a warm-up for us too. It's 3 rounds of 12 to 15 TRX rows. But I think for me, single dumbbell, either hand supported or unsupported. I think once you get into unsupported too, you get into that kind of everything is core talk that we've talked about too, where now you're depending on musculature to be able to keep your core stable as you move this giant weight around, versus when you put your hand down or you have a full supported row, you've created some stabilization for yourself. Once you take your hand off, it's just you and that weight, and the benefits from that in terms of even going into our anti-rotation talk that we were talking about before, it's king there.
And let's not lose sight of the most important part of rowing movements is that you get a sweet bicep pump sometimes too. So you get a little bit of show and all the go. There's really nothing wrong with that. All right, the last one, and this is going to take not a ton of explanation, but a little clarification what we're talking about. The third thing, and probably the most frequently overlooked thing when it comes to vocabulary-wise, is sprint. Very, very, very few people actually sprint in their workouts or their training sessions. You might work at a very high intensity for a relatively short duration of time, but when we talk about sprint, we're talking about something extremely specific in terms of output. So when you would program sprints at LGN, what were you looking for?
It's maximum output for 6 to 10 seconds.
Unsustainable for longer than 6 to 10 seconds.
Unsustainable at that intensity for longer than that. So we would, obviously we do shuttle runs, but even on a shuttle run, we would always coach, I want your first 3 steps to be just urgent and aggressive, and then you can coast the rest of the way to the turf after that. But then your next 3 steps when you turn and come back have to be urgent and aggressive again. But nothing should be, the output fails at 6 to 10 seconds, somewhere around there.
There should be a noticeable drop off if you're watching somebody and they're able to keep a really quick looking pace for 30 to 40 seconds. That's not a sprint. That's a high intensity interval. But sprint should be, so let's look at the most literal expression of that, which would be like sprinting in the Olympics, right?
Right.
There's this really fast guy in the Olympics who's been fast for a long, long time that everybody can imagine, what he looks like when he sprints. But even if you don't think about him, think about everybody else in the field that he's just dusting. They've trained for a long time. decades, right?
Mm-hmm.
And after they do between 9.8 and 10.6 seconds of that event, half of them are laying on the ground,
Yep.
and half of them can't give an interview. And then up to 10 minutes afterwards, they're still kind of pacing around and recovering.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a sprint.
Correct.
Anything less than that, anything less than that sort of physiological impact on your body is just working kind of hard.
Right.
And that's the major difference, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about sprint, it is an all-out, just not frantic, but the highest of intensity you can express in a given movement for no more than 10 seconds. The good thing about it is you don't have to physically sprint down the street to get it. You can pick movements that can really elicit that response. One of my favorite movements or tools to do it with is like the battle rope or the hose wave. You may think that's a little too focused in a body part when it comes to like just moving your arms or just your shoulders, but you can get to an intensity level where you're moving those extremities so hard and fast and your body has to get into it that you can't keep it up for more than 10 seconds, truthfully.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What else have you seen in the gym that you like to throw in as like an all-out sprint activity?
Movement that we did before, we did Smurf jacks. So
Yeah.
those are a good one. Mountain climbers are a good one. You just get yourself in a plank position and drive your knees like you're sprinting for 10 seconds as hard as you can.
Yeah.
We'll do it even in arm burnouts with like tricep press downs or bicep curls with a speed cord, supination, pronation with dumbbells. So anything that you can keep moving super fast for 10 seconds. Medicine ball throws off the wall if you can get up close and do like a short, we call them short sets, but kind of a rapid fire chest pass off of the wall where you're just punching over and over off the wall.
So that's the important thing that you're describing, though, is it's difficult to find things to use because a lot of movements get disqualified because of the rest period within the movement.
Right.
If you're doing a medicine ball hip toss with like a basketball or bouncy rubber medicine ball, there's that 3 feet to the wall and back where you're
Right.
relatively resting, and that can't be part of it. It's got to
Plus
be
the turnaround, the amortization phase.
Yeah, that could be it.
Remember that one.
That's close.
Just the turnaround time between reps of like I finished this rep, but my body's just not fast enough to start the next rep to keep the intensity of what you're looking for.
So there's two words. There's either amateurization phase or
Maybe it's
amortization phase, and I'm not confident in either one of them to tell you the
long
definition.
A1.
Amortization.
Yeah.
So movements like that, even a kettlebell swing, can't be used as a sprint necessarily because you are going to have a period of relaxation
Right.
in there. It's got to be not full body tension. It's got to be a high level of tension for an extremely intense segment of no more than 10 seconds. And
Rapid response runs,
rapid response runs are a good one. Those little tiny fast steps where your arms are moving slow, but you have to flex everything to move that fast. There's a lot of things when you start to get into it. Unfortunately, they do take, once you get past actually running down the street or hose waves or something obvious like that, they do take a coach kind of to
Right.
point you in the right direction. More so, they take a coach to make sure that you're being honest with your effort, because it's easy to be like, man, I'm getting good at these hose waves. And it's like, no, you're just weak. Like you're just not trying as hard. Now, the benefits of sprinting go into the scientific realm. I'm not savvy enough to start quoting muscle fiber types or oxygen uptake types. All I can tell you is that the people that operate in sprint intervals, and this is anecdotally, the people that keep incorporating sprint intervals or sprint type training into their programs that I've seen, their longevity far surpasses people that opt for medium intensity for longer duration.
Yeah.
There's stuff to back it up. Like I said, I didn't do my homework and looking for it before I got here. But I'll tell you, if you look at the most physically able people as they get up in age or even post-injury, they've all kept some sort of sprint, some sort of plyo, some sort of dynamic, complex movement pattern in there. They've also kept pulling and rotation, anti-rotation in there more than anything. Very few truly well individuals as they get up in age have resorted to like the universal machine at the gym and just resorted to one plane of motion at a time or single joint movements.
Well, and I think for us, for our industry too, is, we look at, I kind of look at the forced time curve of being kind of the ultimate indicator of performance. And just to kind of easily explain that is if you look at like a graph, the x-axis is time allotted of doing something, and then the y-axis would be the amount of force that you produce. And it kind of works from like up high on the y-axis, and it swoops down in a curve, and then the longer the time goes, the less force you're able to produce. So the far end of time is a marathon runner, and the far end of force production is a power lifter who can lift 800 pounds one time type thing. And the idea is to kind of shift that curve so that you are able to produce force for a little bit more time at a high capacity, and not be on the far end of either one of those spectrums. Because we know in our industry, it's like our ultimate thing would probably be pull up to the house, you need to smash this door down, crawl 10 feet, and drag this 200-pound thing out, and a marathon pace is not going to help me at that,
Right.
But also I'm a giant man, but forcing that door open gassed me, and that's it.
Right.
And now I can't crawl and can't, perform for the next 20 seconds is also the problem. So it's giving yourself enough usable force to do what we need to do in a very short period of time.
And that doesn't necessarily come with just training in that median phase the entire time.
Correct.
You can't just stay in the middle ground, what would be the middle of that force time continuum, and just stay there forever.
You'll never move the curve then. It's
Right.
the same thing. So think of it as if you run 5Ks and all you do is run 5Ks, you're going to get great at running 5Ks, but you're going to suck at marathons, you're going to suck at sprinting.
Right.
But you just train 5Ks right in the middle. So you have to be able to sprint. You have to be able to do more than a 5K and train those. And that should theoretically move your 5K to be better too.
Yeah. And we've seen that anecdotally too at LGN, where we've taken pretty good marathon runners, and on the other side, pretty strong people.
Mm-hmm.
And they were both kind of examples of what you gave, not occupationally, but they could do one thing really well, and the other side of it was unattainable altogether. And through exposing them to both much heavier weights, almost like a max force scenario, and then longer-ish duration cardio or expenditure, we brought them back to the center in terms of ability, but then their specialization it got better. It didn't get sacrificed by getting better overall.
And that's what we'd hear too, is like people would go out and they'd run all the time, and whatever their 5K would be, and then they'd train with us and not run that much, and then they'd go run a 5K and be like, I cut time off and it was easy.
Right.
Yeah,
well, God forbid your hips work
Right.
somewhat correctly in
Right.
there. Yeah. And you actually have an ass now that you can use.
Yep.
Awesome. All right, so we have rotation, anti-rotation, pulling, and sprinting as the top three that we recognize gaps in the most common gaps in programs. Anything else to throw on the end of this thing, or else we're going to wrap it up?
Wrap it up.
Beautiful. All right, if you need anything else, don't feel hesitant to reach out. It's kind of mixed up on my phrases there. Don't feel willing to reach out anytime. Was it LG at LGN?
At LGN _performance.
An underscore gets me every time, man.
Mm-hmm.
Or at Force Shift Fitness on all social media, forceshiftfit@gmail.com. Let us know if we missed anything. If you want us to talk about anything else, we're going to keep knocking these things out. Talk to you guys soon.